A man in a navy blue suit stepped directly into my path, just as the string quartet finished a slow version of Canon in D. "Excuse me," he said, scanning the crowd behind me. "I've been looking for you for nearly 20 minutes. At first, I thought he had mistaken me for someone else. That happened more often than people might expect. Not because I looked like somebody famous. Because people rarely imagined that someone who looked like me belonged in rooms like this. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 38 years old that summer. I stood 5'10", wore a 7-year-old watch, drove a 9-year-old sedan, and lived in a 900-square-foot apartment that my wife and I had owned for almost a decade. At that moment, more than 200 wedding guests were gathered around crystal chandeliers beneath a glass ceiling overlooking the river. My cousin's wedding had become the largest family event of the year. And my in-laws had spent the previous 6 hours making sure everyone knew exactly how small they thought my life was. The man adjusted his tie. "Mr. Mercer." "Yes." He smiled. "Good, the ownership verification documents have arrived." 3 tables away, my mother-in-law stopped talking. My father-in-law lowered his champagne glass. The best man turned around. And suddenly, every conversation in the room seemed to pause at exactly the same time. Because they all believed they knew who owned this venue. They were about to discover they were wrong. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. The truth is that nobody in my wife's family ever hated me. Hatred would have been simpler. What they felt was disappointment. A quieter emotion. A more persistent one. Disappointment has a way of sounding polite while doing exactly the same damage. I met my wife, Emily, when we were 24. She was intelligent, practical, and remarkably good at understanding people. I was an operations analyst, working 70-hour weeks for a logistics company. Most people who met us assumed Emily was the ambitious one. She carried herself with confidence. She spoke clearly. She made friends easily. I was quieter. I listened more than I talked. What almost nobody understood was that silence and lack of ambition are not the same thing. Growing up, my family lived in a 2-bedroom house on the edge of town. My father repaired industrial equipment. My mother worked part-time at a library. Money wasn't abundant, but stability was. My parents had one rule: never spend money to impress people who won't remember you next month. At age 12, I learned a lesson that stayed with me. A classmate named Trevor invited 21 kids to a birthday party at a giant entertainment center. Arcades, go-karts, laser tag, everything a 12-year-old could want. I wasn't invited. When I asked why, another boy shrugged. "My dad says your family doesn't really fit in." That afternoon, I sat at our kitchen table, trying to pretend it didn't bother me. My father noticed. He listened. Then he opened a notebook. Inside were pages of calculations, savings plans, investment projections, retirement estimates. Every page was covered in numbers. "Most people spend their lives trying to look rich," he said. "What's the alternative?" He tapped the notebook. "Become secure." At 12, I didn't fully understand. At 38, I understood perfectly. That lesson shaped almost every major decision I made. I graduated near the top of my university class. Started at $48,000 a year. Saved aggressively. Avoided debt. Lived below my means. Invested consistently. Nothing glamorous. Nothing exciting. Just thousands of small decisions, repeated for years. By 32, I had accumulated enough capital to purchase minority stakes in several commercial properties through private partnerships. Most people never knew. I preferred it that way. When people ask how wealth grows, They imagine dramatic breakthroughs. The reality is usually spreadsheets, patience, and time. Emily understood this. Her parents did not. My father-in-law, Richard Collins, was 66. He had built a successful regional sales company. He believed status communicated competence. To Richard, appearances mattered because appearances opened doors. In fairness, he wasn't entirely wrong. His worldview came from experience. He had grown up poor. When he finally became successful, he associated visible success with safety. Large homes, luxury vehicles, exclusive memberships. Those things reassured him. My mother-in-law, Sandra Collins, was 63. She cared deeply about social perception. Not because she was cruel, because she genuinely believed reputation determined opportunity. She evaluated people through visible indicators. Neighborhoods, clothing brands, vacation destinations, restaurants, schools. If those signals suggested success, she trusted you. If they didn't, she worried about you. Then there was Emily's younger brother, Ryan. 34. Charismatic. Funny. Perpetually chasing the next opportunity. Ryan leased cars he couldn't afford and bought watches with financing plans longer than some mortgages. His social media looked like the life of a millionaire. His bank statements told a different story. None of these people were villains. They simply measured achievement differently than I did. And for 14 years, those differences created tension. Every holiday included subtle comparisons. Every gathering included questions. When are you upgrading? Have you looked at larger homes? Don't you think Emily deserves more space? The comments were rarely direct attacks. They were framed as concern. Concern is often criticism, wearing a nicer outfit. The apartment became their favorite topic. Emily and I bought it when we were 29. 900 square feet. 2 bedrooms. Walking distance from downtown. Fully paid off by age 35. To us, it represented freedom. To her family, it represented failure. The irony was almost funny. By then, our investment income alone exceeded the salaries of several relatives criticizing us. But explaining that would have required conversations I didn't want to have. So I stayed quiet. That became a pattern. People often assume silence means weakness. Sometimes silence simply means you don't feel obligated to defend your choices. The wedding invitation arrived 8 months before the event. My cousin Lauren was marrying Michael Foster. They had chosen one of the most prestigious waterfront venues in the state. The property covered nearly 14 acres. Glass architecture, private gardens, river access, a waiting list extending almost 2 years. The venue became a topic of conversation immediately. Everyone talked about it. Everyone admired it. Everyone assumed it belonged to a well-known hospitality corporation. That assumption would later become important. 6 weeks before the wedding, Emily received a group call from her parents. The discussion quickly shifted toward accommodations. Sandra mentioned that many guests would be staying at a luxury hotel nearby. Then she laughed. Well, Daniel and Emily probably won't be used to suites that size. A few people chuckled. Emily didn't. Neither did I. The comment passed, like most comments did. But something about it reminded me of that birthday party from childhood. The same message, hidden beneath different words. You don't belong here. The wedding weekend arrived during a warm June stretch. 234 guests attended. The rehearsal dinner included 91 people. The ceremony itself overlooked the river at sunset. Everything was beautiful. Lauren looked radiant. Michael looked terrified in the way happy grooms often do. The day should have been entirely about them. Instead, Several relatives found ways to turn my apartment into a recurring joke. The first comment happened during cocktail hour. Ryan introduced me to one of his friends. "This is Daniel," he said, "living proof that a married couple can survive in under 1,000 square feet." Everyone laughed. I smiled politely. The second came from Sandra. She was speaking with two women near the dessert station. As I approached, she gestured toward me. "Daniel's very practical." Then she lowered her voice just enough. "Sometimes too practical." The women nodded. The third happened at dinner. Richard examined the seating chart. "Must be nice," he said. "No large property taxes." The table laughed again. I noticed something interesting. Nobody intended these comments to be devastating. That's often how humiliation works. Tiny cuts, repeated over time. Each one individually insignificant. Together, they tell a story about your place in the hierarchy. By 9 o'clock, I had heard 6 separate remarks regarding our apartment. Emily squeezed my hand beneath the table. "You okay?" "Of course." "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend you're not irritated." I smiled. She knew me too well. The truth was that I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of conversations based entirely on appearances. Tired of people assuming square footage measured success. Tired of watching intelligent adults reduce worth to visible consumption. Then came the comment that changed everything. Sandra stood with several guests near the dance floor. One woman asked whether Emily and I planned to move. Sandra laughed. "Oh, eventually they will." Then she added, "People stay in starter homes until life catches up." The group smiled. Some nodded. One person actually said, "Exactly." I saw Emily hear it. I saw the brief flicker in her expression. That hurt more than any comment directed at me. Because she had spent years defending choices we made together. I walked outside. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly. The river reflected strings of lights hanging from nearby trees. Music drifted through open doors. I checked my phone. Then I sent a single message. No speech. No confrontation. One message. Less than 15 words. A response arrived 8 minutes later. "Understood. Documents on the way." I put my phone away and returned inside. Nobody noticed. The evening continued. Dancing. Photographs. Toasts. Laughter. Then the best man took the microphone. His name was Andrew Sinclair. 39. Confident. Articulate. One of Michael's closest friends. The room settled. Andrew began telling stories about the couple. Everyone laughed. The mood was perfect. Halfway through his speech, a venue manager approached him discreetly. They exchanged a few words. Andrew looked surprised, then curious, then amused. The manager handed him the Andrew looked at it. His eyebrows rose. He glanced towards the mirror, toward me. For a minute, I had seen him smile. Then he smiled. A very different smile. The kind someone gives when they suddenly understand a joke before everyone else. He finished the toast. Applause filled the room. Then he tapped the microphone again. "Actually," he said, "before I sit down, I've just learned something fascinating." People laughed. He held up the folder. "Apparently, I've spent 18 months talking about how incredible this venue is." More laughter. Which is embarrassing, because I didn't know who actually owned it. The room grew quieter. Andrew looked toward the center tables. "Mr. Mercer." Every head turned. I wish they wouldn't. "Would you mind standing?" Slowly I stood. Confusion spread through the room. Sandra frowned. Richard looked puzzled. Ryan appeared amused. Andrew opened the folder. Well, this is unexpected. A few guests laughed nervously. Andrew continued. It appears that the ownership entity for this property is Mercer River Holdings. Silence. Complete silence. Then, which, according to these documents, is majority controlled by Daniel Mercer. The room froze. I heard a fork hit a plate somewhere behind me. Andrew looked genuinely delighted. Daniel. I nodded. Is this correct? Yes. The silence deepened. Because suddenly, dozens of conversations from the past decade rearranged themselves inside people's minds. Starter apartment. Modest car. Quiet lifestyle. Ownership of one of the most prestigious wedding venues in the region. Those facts didn't fit together. Andrew laughed softly. Well, nobody knew what to say. Richard stared at me. Sandra blinked several times. Ryan actually looked around, as though someone might explain it. Finally, Andrew shook his head. I've never been I've been talking about the wrong person. The room reacted to my questions came instantly. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I stood while people processed information. The truth wasn't as dramatic as anyone imagined. 15 years earlier, a small investment partnership had acquired land near the river. The development expanded. Additional investors joined. Properties appreciated. Ownership structures evolved. Over time, I increased my stake while other partners exited. Eventually, the venue became one component of a larger portfolio. Nothing magical. No secret inheritance. No lottery ticket. Just years of reinvesting profits. The documents Andrew held simply confirmed current ownership percentages. Facts. Numbers. Nothing more. Yet facts have a strange effect when they collide with assumptions. People become fascinated not by the facts themselves, but by the gap between expectation and reality. After the announcement, guests approached continuously. Questions. Congratulations. Curiosity. Some seemed impressed. Others seemed embarrassed. Several appeared uncertain how to behave. I answered politely. Then I returned attention to Lauren and Michael. It was their wedding. Not my moment. But consequences had already begun. Sandra spent nearly 20 minutes sitting quietly. That alone was remarkable. Eventually she approached. Daniel. Hi, Sandra. She looked uncomfortable. A rare expression for her. You never mentioned this. No one asked. The answer wasn't intended as a jab. Just truth. She nodded slowly. I suppose that's fair. For several seconds, she seemed unsure what came next. Then she surprised me. I may have misunderstood some things. Not a complete apology. Not dramatic. But genuine. And genuine matters more than perfect wording. Richard reacted differently. He requested details. Numbers. Structures. Timelines. That was his nature. He respected achievement once he recognized it. The next hour resembled an informal business seminar. For the first time in 14 years, he asked questions without condescension. Ryan's reaction was perhaps the most revealing. Near midnight, he found me outside. Can I ask something? Sure. Why live in that apartment? The question contained no mockery. Only confusion. I considered it. Because I like it. He laughed. No, seriously. I am serious. He stared. I continued. It's paid off. We enjoy the neighborhood. The maintenance is minimal. The commute is short. Most importantly, it supports the life we want. Ryan looked at the river. You know nobody understands that, right? That's okay. For the first time, he nodded rather than arguing. The following weeks revealed the real impact. Not because people suddenly treated me like royalty. They didn't. And I wouldn't have wanted them to. What changed was the conversation. The apartment stopped being evidence of failure. The same apartment. Same size. Same location. Same everything. Only the perception changed. That fascinated me. Because the apartment itself had never been the issue. The story people attached to it had been. Once they learned other facts, the exact same decision became intelligent instead of embarrassing. Nothing about the property changed. Only the narrative. Several months later, Lauren invited Emily and me to dinner. During dessert, she laughed. You realize half the family still talks about that wedding. I groaned. Sorry. No, she said, you don't understand. She smiled. People aren't talking about the venue. What are they talking about? The fact that they spent years judging a life they didn't understand. That stayed with me. Because she was right. The venue wasn't important. The documents weren't important. Even ownership wasn't important. The real story involved assumptions. We build systems in our minds for evaluating people. Income. Homes. Clothes. Cars. Job titles. Vacations. The problem isn't that those indicators contain information. Sometimes they do. The problem is believing they contain the whole story. A year later, another milestone arrived. A regional business publication released a list recognizing long-term community investors who had contributed to local development projects. My name appeared near the bottom. A small mention. Nothing major. But the recognition mattered because it reflected something real. Not status. Contribution. Impact. Projects completed. Jobs created. Communities improved. When the article appeared, Richard called. I read it. Thanks. A pause. Then, I spent a long time thinking success had to look a certain way. I waited. I was wrong about that. For Richard, those 6 words represented a monumental shift. People rarely change overnight. They change one realization at a time. Sandra changed too. Gradually. She stopped making comments about houses. Stopped comparing lifestyles. Stopped measuring people through visible signals quite so aggressively. Not perfectly. Nobody changes perfectly. But noticeably. The apartment remained exactly where it had always been. Emily and I still lived there. Still walked to our favorite coffee shop every Saturday. Still hosted friends in a dining area many relatives considered too small. Still enjoyed our life. The funny thing is that people eventually began calling our choices intentional. That word made me smile. When you're unknown, restraint looks like limitation. When you're successful, the exact same restraint looks intentional. Human beings are strange that way. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about money. It isn't about property ownership. And it certainly isn't about proving people wrong. The deeper lesson is that every family operates within a system. Not a legal system. A social one. An invisible structure made of assumptions, expectations, and stories people tell about each other. Over time, those stories harden into identities. The responsible one. The reckless one. The successful one. The disappointment. The achiever. The underachiever. The problem is that systems continue running long after the facts change. People keep seeing the version of you they decided on years ago. Sometimes decades ago. And occasionally, it takes one unexpected document to reveal that the system has been inaccurate all along. Not because the document changes reality. Because it forces everyone to finally see reality. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever been judged for something people completely misunderstood about your life? Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. 2. The interesting part is that most people think the story ended that night. It didn't. If anything, that wedding simply exposed tensions that had been quietly accumulating for years. 3 days after we returned home, Emily and I were sitting at our small kitchen table. The same table her parents had criticized dozens of times. The same table where we paid bills, planned vacations, and spent Sunday mornings drinking coffee. Emily was reviewing emails when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then raised an eyebrow. "Mom." I laughed. "That didn't take long." She answered. I listened to only her side of the conversation. "Hi, Mom." A pause. "Yes, we're home." Another pause. "No, we're not busy." Then her expression shifted. Not shocked, just surprised. "Really?" A longer silence followed. Finally, she said, "Okay, Saturday works." When the call ended, she set the phone down. "What happened?" "My parents want to come over." I nearly spilled my coffee. "To the apartment." "Yes, that apartment." She laughed. "The very same." For 14 years, Richard and Sandra had visited exactly 3 times. Each visit had included at least one comment about moving somewhere larger. Now they were requesting dinner. Voluntarily. Life can be funny. Saturday arrived. Emily cooked pasta. I prepared salad. At 6 o'clock sharp, her parents arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine. Sandra stepped inside and looked around. Not critically. Thoughtfully. That alone felt unusual. Richard examined the living room. The bookshelves. The artwork. The balcony overlooking the park. Finally, he sat down. "You know," he said, "it's actually larger than I remembered." Emily nearly choked, trying not to laugh. After dinner, the conversation drifted toward investments. For years, I had avoided discussing money. Now Richard wanted details. Not because he was greedy, because curiosity had replaced assumption. The distinction mattered. "How long have you owned part of the venue?" he asked. "About 11 years. And nobody knew. Most partners prefer privacy." Sandra shook her head. "I still don't understand how someone owns something like that and lives here." Emily smiled. "Because we like living here." Sandra looked around again. This time, she noticed things she had previously ignored. The custom bookshelves. The hardwood floors. The renovated kitchen. The absence of clutter. The comfort. People often fail to see what's directly in front of them when they're distracted by what they expected to find. As the evening ended, Sandra stopped at the door. "Daniel." "Yes." "I owe you an apology." The words arrived quietly. Without drama. Without witnesses. "I spent years assuming things." I nodded. She continued. "And I think I confused appearance with reality." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I smiled. "Thank you." That was enough. Some apologies become powerful because of what they don't include. No excuses. No qualifications. No attempt to shift blame. Just acknowledgement. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. Family gatherings became easier. Not perfect, but easier. The jokes disappeared. The comparisons faded. The constant questioning stopped. At Thanksgiving, Ryan arrived driving a brand new luxury SUV. Normally, he would have spent the entire day talking about it. This time, he barely mentioned it. Halfway through dinner, he sat beside me. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous hobby." He laughed. "No, seriously." He lowered his voice. How do you decide what's enough? The question surprised me. Enough what? Money, space, stuff, success. I considered it, then answered honestly. When the next upgrade doesn't improve your life. Ryan stared. That's it. Pretty much. He leaned back. You make everything sound simple. Most important things are simple. Not easy. No, I said. Definitely not easy. A few weeks later, he called unexpectedly. He had sold the SUV. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The lease payments had become exhausting. The vehicle impressed strangers. It didn't make him happier. That realization changed him more than any lecture ever could. The biggest shift, however, came from a person nobody expected. Emily's Aunt Patricia. Patricia was 71. Sharp-minded. Observant. The unofficial historian of the family. She called one evening. Do you know what fascinated me about the wedding? What's that? Not the reveal. Then what? The reactions. I laughed. That was fascinating. No, she said. Listen carefully. I did. For years, people saw evidence that supported their assumptions. She paused. Then they saw evidence that contradicted them. Okay. Most people faced a choice. What choice? Either admit they were wrong or invent a new explanation. I thought about it. She was right. Human beings rarely abandon narratives gracefully. We protect them, defend them, rationalize them. Sometimes, even after reality proves them false. Patricia continued. The people who grew after the wedding were the ones willing to revise their stories. That conversation stayed with me because it explained something larger than family dynamics. It explained organizations, friendships, communities, entire societies. We all carry stories about other people, and those stories influence behavior long before we verify whether they're true. The following spring brought another surprise. The venue hosted a charity gala, one of the largest events of the year. Nearly 400 attendees. Several local business leaders, community organizations, media representatives. I attended because one of our partners requested it. Emily joined me. During the reception, a woman approached. She introduced herself as the executive director of a nonprofit organization. We talked for 10 minutes, then 20. Eventually, she asked a question. What do you do? I smiled. Which answer would you like? She laughed. The honest one. I manage investments. That's vague. Intentionally. Her laughter grew louder. That exchange reminded me of something. The people who were most genuinely accomplished rarely led conversations with accomplishments. They didn't need to. Their identity wasn't dependent upon constant validation. Years earlier, I might not have recognized that pattern. Now I saw it everywhere. As the gala continued, I noticed another familiar face. Richard. He was speaking with several guests. One man asked whether he knew me. Richard nodded, then said something I never expected to hear. Daniel's one of the smartest investors I've ever met. I almost turned around to check whether another Daniel had entered the room. But he was talking about me. The compliment wasn't important because it boosted my ego. It mattered because it reflected genuine respect. Respect earned through understanding rather than assumption. Later that night, Richard found me near the terrace. You heard that, didn't you? Heard what? The conversation. I smiled. Maybe. He shook his head. You know, I spent 30 years trying to make sure people knew I was successful. I waited. Then I met someone who spent 30 years making sure nobody cared. We both laughed. His description wasn't entirely accurate, but it was close enough. A month later, another event reinforced the lesson. One of Emily's cousins announced an engagement. Family excitement exploded immediately. Plans began. Guest lists formed. Venues were discussed. At one dinner, someone mentioned luxury accommodations. Years earlier, that conversation would have turned toward comparisons. Who lived where? Who owned what? Who had upgraded recently? Instead, something different happened. Sandra interrupted. None of that matters. The table went silent. She continued. What matters is whether they're building the life they actually want. Several people exchanged surprised glances, including me. The statement wasn't remarkable because it was profound. It was remarkable because of who said it. Growth often reveals itself through ordinary sentences. The next year brought perhaps the most meaningful milestone of all. Not financial. Not professional. Personal. Emily and I celebrated 15 years of marriage. We hosted a small gathering. 23 people. Family and close friends. Guess where? The apartment. The famous apartment. The allegedly temporary apartment. The apartment people once treated like evidence. By then it had become something else. A symbol. Not of wealth. Not of status. Of intention. Sandra helped arrange flowers. Richard grilled food on the balcony. Ryan brought dessert. At one point, I stood in the kitchen watching everyone laugh. Watching conversations overlap. Watching family occupy every available corner of our modest home. And suddenly, I remembered that 12-year-old boy sitting at the kitchen table after being excluded from a birthday party. Back then, I believed acceptance came from proving yourself. Acquiring enough. Achieving enough. Winning enough. Age taught me something different. Real acceptance begins when you stop organizing your life around obtaining it. You make decisions. You build a life. You choose values. And eventually, the right people either understand or they don't. Both outcomes are survivable. That evening, after everyone left, Emily and I sat on the balcony. The city lights reflected across nearby windows. The same view we'd enjoyed for years. Any regrets? She asked. About what? Not moving. I looked around. The familiar walls. The familiar neighborhood. The familiar life. Then I smiled. None. She leaned against my shoulder. Good. The truth is that people still make assumptions. They always will. Some see a modest apartment and imagine limitations. Others see luxury and imagine success. Both judgments can be wrong. Reality is usually more complicated. And more interesting. The wedding revealed ownership of a venue. But that wasn't the real revelation. The real revelation was discovering how many people had mistaken visible choices for complete stories. Once they learned more, they revised their conclusions. That's growth. Not perfection. Growth. And in the years that followed, that growth changed our family far more than any ownership document ever could. Because ultimately, the venue was never the point. The apartment wasn't the point either. The point was understanding that value and visibility are not the same thing. The people who learn that lesson early gain freedom. The people who learn it late still gain something valuable. Perspective. And sometimes perspective is worth more than any property you'll ever own. About 6 months after our 15th anniversary, I experienced something that forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years. The truth wasn't about money. It wasn't about family. It wasn't even about reputation. It was about identity. For most of my adult life, I had quietly enjoyed being underestimated. At first it happened accidentally. Then it became a habit. Eventually, it became part of who I was. There was a certain comfort in walking into a room where nobody expected much from you. No pressure, no performance, no need to maintain an image. But every advantage has a hidden cost. And one afternoon, that cost became impossible to ignore. The realization started during a quarterly meeting with several investment partners. We gathered in a conference room overlooking downtown. 8 people, 3 hours, stacks of reports, the usual. Halfway through the meeting, a younger analyst presented a proposal. He was bright, prepared, confident, yet I noticed something familiar. Every time he made a recommendation, he softened it, qualified it, explained it twice, almost apologizing for having an opinion. After the meeting ended, I asked him to stay behind. His name was Kevin, 28 years old. Reminded me of myself. "You know your numbers," I said. "Thank you. Then why do you keep acting uncertain?" He frowned. "I don't. You do." He thought for a moment, then sighed. "People don't really listen until someone more important repeats what I said." There it was. A belief. One I knew well, because I had carried a version of it for years. Kevin continued. "Sometimes it feels easier to stay quiet." I looked out the window, then back at him. "Be careful." "About what?" "Silence can protect you." He nodded. "It can also hide you." The words surprised even me, because they weren't really meant for Kevin. They were meant for myself. That conversation followed me home. For several days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had spent years avoiding attention, years avoiding recognition, years deliberately staying in the background, mostly for good reasons, but maybe not entirely. Maybe part of me had become too comfortable letting people underestimate me. Maybe humility had slowly blended into avoidance. The distinction mattered. A few weeks later, Emily noticed my mood. "You're thinking again." Dangerous observation. "You always get philosophical when something's bothering you." I laughed. "Do I?" "Absolutely." She set down her coffee. "What is it?" I considered how to explain, then finally said, "Do you think I've hidden too much?" Her expression changed immediately. Not surprised. Thoughtful, as though she had already considered the question. "Sometimes." That answer caught me off guard. "Really?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say anything?" "You never asked." "Fair enough." I smiled. She continued. "There's a difference between privacy and invisibility." I leaned back. "Go on." "You've always been private." "That's true. But occasionally, you act like being seen is something negative." I didn't answer immediately, because I wasn't sure she was wrong. For years, my strategy had been simple. Work quietly. Invest quietly. Live quietly. Avoid unnecessary attention. Most of the time, that approach worked beautifully. But Emily was pointing toward something deeper. Maybe I had started treating recognition as a threat rather than a tool. The following month provided an unexpected test. One of our community development projects reached completion. A mixed-use property that had taken nearly 4 years to finish. The city organized a public ribbon-cutting ceremony. Normally, I would have attended quietly and disappeared afterward. This time, the organizers requested something different. They wanted me to speak. 10 minutes. That's all. A simple acknowledgement of the project. My first instinct was immediate. Decline. Find someone else. Avoid the spotlight. Then I remembered Kevin. Silence can protect you. It can also hide you. So I agreed. The morning of the ceremony, I stood behind a temporary stage reviewing notes. Roughly 200 people had gathered. Local residents, business owners, officials, families. Nothing enormous. Yet my stomach felt strangely nervous. Not because I feared public speaking. Because I wasn't used to occupying visible space. When my turn came, I walked to the microphone. The crowd settled. For a moment, I looked across the audience. Then I began. I didn't talk about investments, or profits, or ownership structures. Instead, I talked about patience, about long-term thinking, about communities, about creating things that outlast individual recognition. The speech lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, people applauded. Nothing dramatic, nothing life-changing, just appreciation. Yet afterward, several young professionals approached. They asked questions, requested advice, wanted to learn. One conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Driving home later, I realized something important. Visibility wasn't inherently vanity. Sometimes visibility created opportunities for contribution. The lesson arrived at exactly the right moment, because another challenge was approaching. Ryan. Over the previous 2 years, Emily's brother had changed significantly. The transformation wasn't sudden. It happened through dozens of small decisions. Selling the luxury SUV, reducing debt, learning about investing, asking questions instead of pretending to know answers. Growth rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. But eventually, the results become obvious. One evening, Ryan called. "Can we meet?" Of course. We met at a coffee shop near my office. Ryan arrived carrying a notebook. An actual notebook. 10 years earlier, I would have assumed it belonged to someone else. He sat down, then immediately got to the point. "I think I made a mistake." "What happened?" "I built my whole life around impressing people." The honesty surprised me. He stared into his coffee. "And the worst part." "What?" "Most of those people weren't paying attention." I nodded slowly. Ryan laughed. Not happily. More like someone recognizing an uncomfortable truth. For years, I thought success meant looking successful. I remembered conversations from long ago. The expensive watches. The leased vehicles. The constant upgrades. He wasn't wrong about his past. Eventually, he opened the notebook. Inside were budgets, goals, savings targets, investment plans. The pages reminded me of my father's notebook from decades earlier. For a moment, I just stared. Ryan noticed. "What?" "Nothing." I smiled, just remembering something. That afternoon became one of the most meaningful conversations we ever shared. Not because I taught him anything revolutionary, because he had become willing to learn. That's where real change begins. A year later, Ryan paid off nearly all his consumer debt. 2 years later, he purchased a modest townhouse. 3 years later, he started mentoring younger employees at his company. The transformation wasn't financial. It was psychological. He stopped measuring himself against strangers. And once he did, everything improved. Around that same time, Sandra experienced her own turning point. It happened during a family gathering. One of Emily's younger cousins introduced a new boyfriend. Nice guy. Hardworking. Polite. Nervous. The kind of person trying desperately to make a good impression. During dinner, someone asked where he lived. He mentioned a small apartment. The old Sandra would have reacted instantly. Questions. Comparisons. Suggestions. Instead, she smiled. "Do you like living there?" The young man looked surprised. "Yes." "Then that's what matters." The The conversation moved on. Simple. Ordinary. Yet I nearly laughed out loud. Because 5 years earlier, that response would have been unimaginable. People don't always change completely, but they can change meaningfully. And meaningful change is enough. The next major chapter began unexpectedly. A regional university invited me to participate in a panel discussion about long-term investing. Normally, I would have declined. Now I accepted. The audience included students and young professionals. Hundreds of them. During the question and answer session, a student raised her hand. What was your biggest investment success? The room waited. They expected a company, a property, a strategy. Instead, I answered honestly. My marriage. Several people laughed, but I wasn't joking. I explained. Every financial decision Emily and I made had been easier because our values aligned. Every challenge became manageable because we approached it together. Every long-term plan benefited from trust. Money compounds. Relationships compound too. The audience became very quiet. Afterward, a professor approached me. You know, he said, that's probably the answer they'll remember. Maybe he was right. Years later, when I look back, very few numbers stand out. Properties blur together. Transactions fade. Percentages become meaningless. What remains are people. Conversations. Lessons. Moments. One evening, nearly 4 years after the wedding, Emily and I attended another family celebration. Different cousin. Different venue. Different circumstances. Yet as I stood watching relatives mingle, I noticed something. Nobody was discussing houses. Nobody was comparing cars. Nobody was evaluating vacations. The atmosphere felt lighter. Healthier. Not perfect. Families are never perfect. But healthier. At one point, Patricia, the family historian, appeared beside me. Interesting, isn't it? What is? She gestured toward the crowd. The system changed. I smiled. The word immediately caught my attention. System. The same concept I had thought about so often. Maybe. She shook her head. No, definitely. I looked around again. Maybe she was right. Systems aren't changed through arguments. They're changed through accumulated evidence. Through examples. Through people choosing different behaviors repeatedly. Eventually, new norms emerge. New expectations. New assumptions. The old hierarchy had quietly faded. Not completely, but significantly. People cared less about appearances, more about substance, less about status, more about character. It wasn't revolutionary, just better. As the evening continued, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For a moment, I found myself thinking about that wedding years earlier. The venue, the document, the silence that followed. At the time, it felt like a climax. Now it felt like a beginning. Because the most important consequences weren't immediate. They unfolded slowly. Across years. Across relationships. Across countless ordinary moments. The ownership document revealed who controlled a property. Time revealed who people actually were. And that's a far more valuable discovery. Eventually, Emily joined me. What are you thinking about? The wedding. She laughed. You still think about that? Sometimes. Why? I looked through the glass toward our family inside. Talking. Laughing. Growing older together. Then I answered. Because it taught me something. What? That people can surprise you. She smiled. In good ways. In good ways. For years, I had focused on the assumptions people made, the judgments, the misunderstandings. What I failed to appreciate was something equally important. People are capable of revising those assumptions, capable of growth, capable of becoming better than they were before. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. And in the end, that's probably the most hopeful lesson of all. 5 years after my cousin's wedding, I received a phone call that would have seemed impossible back when all of this began. The caller was Richard, my father-in-law, the same man who once measured success through square footage, property taxes, and visible status. The same man who had spent years suggesting that Emily and I were somehow stuck in a temporary phase of life. Now he sounded uncertain, almost nervous. "Daniel, do you have time to talk?" "Of course." There was a pause, then another. Finally, he said, "I need advice." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Richard Collins asking me for advice would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. What kind of advice? Life advice. That surprised me even more. We agreed to meet the following afternoon. When I arrived at his office, I immediately noticed something different. The room had changed. Not physically, psychologically. For years, Richard's office had resembled a showroom. Awards, photographs, recognition plaques, evidence of achievement everywhere. Now many of those items were gone. The walls felt simpler, calmer. He gestured toward a chair. After a few minutes of small talk, he leaned back. "I think I spent too much of my life chasing the wrong things." That wasn't how I expected the conversation to begin. "What brought this on?" He looked out the window, then smiled faintly. "Retirement. Retirement has a way of stripping away illusions. Careers end. Titles disappear. Status becomes less relevant. Eventually, people confront a difficult question. Who am I when nobody needs my business card?" Richard had retired 6 months earlier. At first, he loved it. Golf, travel, freedom. Then reality arrived. The novelty faded. The calendar emptied. And for the first time in decades, he found himself evaluating his life without the usual distractions. "I achieved most of the things I wanted," he said. "That's good." "Yes, but it's strange." "How?" He folded his hands. "The things I thought would matter the most barely matter at all now." I listened. The house matters less. The cars matter less. The awards matter less. He laughed quietly. "Honestly, half the accomplishments I spent years worrying about aren't even interesting anymore." Then he said something that stayed with me. "The only things that still feel important are people." Simple, obvious, completely true. We spent nearly 3 hours talking. Not about investments, not about business, about meaning, family, legacy, purpose. When I left, I realized something. Growth doesn't stop at 60, or 70, or 80. As long as people remain willing to question themselves, growth remains possible. That lesson became even more relevant the following year. Because that was the year Emily and I finally moved. Not because anyone pressured us. Not because we needed validation. Because our lives had changed. My work required additional space. Emily had begun consulting from home several days each week. The apartment that had served us so well for nearly 2 decades no longer fit our practical needs. So we bought a house. A nice house. Not enormous. Not extravagant. Just right. The funny part, almost nobody reacted the way I expected. Years earlier, relatives would have treated the move like proof that they had been right all along. Instead, the responses were surprisingly thoughtful. Sandra visited during the first week. She walked through the house, admired the kitchen, complimented the backyard. Then she smiled. You know what's funny? What? If you'd bought this house 15 years ago, I would have thought it meant success. I laughed. And now? Now I know success happened long before the house. That may have been the wisest thing I'd ever heard her say. The house wasn't a reward. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't a trophy. It was simply a house. Useful. Comfortable. Practical. Nothing more. That's one of the strangest consequences of maturity. The things people spend years chasing often lose their symbolic power once they're achieved. Objects become objects again. A few months after moving, Emily discovered a storage box hidden in the back of a closet. Inside were old photographs, letters, receipts, documents, the accumulated debris of adult life. One item immediately caught my attention. A faded notebook. My father's notebook. The same one he showed me when I was 12 years old. The notebook that appeared after I wasn't invited to that birthday party. I hadn't seen it in years. I opened it carefully. The pages were worn, yellowed, fragile, yet the numbers remained. Savings goals, investment calculations, retirement projections, handwritten notes. Near the back, I found something I didn't remember. A sentence written in blue ink. Only 7 words. Security is freedom disguised as patience. I stared at the page for a long time. Because that single sentence explained almost every major decision of my adult life. Not wealth. Not status. Freedom. The ability to choose. The ability to say yes. The ability to say no. The ability to build a life according to your values rather than someone else's expectations. That notebook eventually became one of my most treasured possessions. Not because of the financial lessons, because it represented perspective. Perspective passed from one generation to another. Around that same time, another interesting thing happened. Ryan became a father. Watching him hold his daughter for the first time revealed a completely different side of him. The old Ryan had constantly worried about appearances. The new Ryan worried about bedtime schedules, pediatric appointments, and whether tiny socks could somehow disappear into another dimension. Parenthood reorganized his priorities almost overnight. One afternoon he called me. Can I ask a weird question? Go ahead. What do you think she'll remember? Who? My daughter. I considered it. About me. Yes. The answer came surprisingly quickly. She'll remember how you made her feel. Silence. Then. Not what I bought her. No. Not what kind of house we live in. No. Not the car. Definitely not the car. He laughed. Then grew quiet. Good. That conversation marked another shift. The cycle was continuing. Lessons moving forward. One generation influencing the next. Years passed. Not dramatically. Just steadily. Birthdays. Anniversaries. Graduations. Ordinary life. The best kind. Then came an event that brought everything full circle. My father turned 80. We organized a celebration with close friends and family. Nothing extravagant. Just meaningful. During dinner, someone asked him the secret to a successful life. My father thought for nearly a minute before answering. Everyone waited. Finally, he said, "Learn the difference between enough and more." The room became quiet, because everyone immediately understood what he meant. Many people spend their entire lives pursuing more. More money. More recognition. More possessions. More approval. More status. More everything. The problem is that more has no finish line. Enough does. My father continued. Once you know what enough looks like, life becomes much simpler. I looked around the table. Emily, Richard, Sandra, Ryan, Patricia. People whose journeys had intersected with that lesson in different ways. Some learned it early. Some learned it late. Some were still learning. We all are. Later that evening, after most guests had left, my father and I sat outside watching the sunset. The same way we had done dozens of times over the years. He asked a question. Do people still talk about that wedding? I laughed. Occasionally. Funny. What is? You know what I remember about it? What? Nothing. I looked at him. Nothing. He nodded. I don't remember the venue. I don't remember the document. I don't remember who said what. Then, what do you remember? He smiled. I remember that you stayed calm. That's all. Not the reveal. Not the recognition. Not the surprise. The response. The choice. The behavior. As I thought about it, I realized he was right. The details that feel enormous in the moment often fade. Character tends to remain. Years later, nobody remembers every argument, every insult, every misunderstanding. What they remember is how people handled them. That realization became one of the final pieces of the puzzle for me. The wedding had never been about proving anyone wrong. The apartment had never been about being right. The venue had never been about ownership. Those were merely circumstances. The real story was about values surviving pressure, about refusing to build an identity around other people's opinions, about recognizing that validation gained through revelation is temporary, while self-respect gained through consistency lasts. Eventually, the evening ended. The chairs were folded. The lights dimmed. Guests went home. Life moved forward, as it always does. And whenever I think back to the moment the best man announced who owned the venue, I no longer remember the shock on people's faces. I remember something else. The silence. Not because silence proved anything. Because for one brief moment, every assumption in the room stopped talking. And reality finally had a chance to speak.